rise. The Court of Appeals, Division 1 is now in session.
Please be seated. This is the time scheduled for oral argument in our case number 1CA-TX140013, Chevron USA, Inc., the Arizona Department of Revenue. Each side has been allocated 20 minutes for oral argument. The appellant, there's a clock on the podium which shows how much time you have left. If you desire to leave any time for rebuttal, that clock shows your rebuttal time too. So if it shows 5 minutes, you've got 5 minutes left, including the rebuttal time. You have to manage your own time. While you've each been allocated 20 minutes, there's no requirement in the rules that you have to use them. So if you're done talking and we don't have any more questions, just sit down. So you're done and you can sit down. To assist you, you should be aware that we have conferenced this case, we've discussed it, we've read the briefs, we've looked at the applicable law and record, so you can guide yourself accordingly on what you want to argue. Finally, you should be aware that we are both, there's audio and video recording of the argument. So when you approach the approach the podium, first state your name and who you're representing, and recognize that you are on TV, you're being recorded, and in a couple of days you'll be able to watch the argument on YouTube. So, with that, counsel for the appellant.
Good morning. May it please the Court. Mark Fuller on behalf of the taxpayer Chevron. With me at counsel table is co-counsel James Busby, and the Amici, counsel for Amici, have ceded their time to me anytime that they might use. I think oral argument is useful in many cases to bring a healthy dose of common sense to a case and a big picture analysis. And so with that in mind, I'd like to start by looking at the big picture both factually and legally. First, though, a point of order. Yesterday afternoon, the Supreme Court...
We're aware of it.
Okay.
CCI.
Yes.
We're aware of it.
Okay. All right, so I want to start with something that is so basic and so obvious that I think it can get lost perhaps in the mix. I believe it has gotten lost a bit in the answering brief, and that is this. Machinery is made up of parts. Now, it sounds very obvious. Hundreds, thousands of parts work together in an...
Sorry to interrupt, but is equipment also made up of parts?
Equipment, I believe, is. Now, the Amici make a good point that the statute is written in the disjunctive, machinery and equipment. I don't know that...
Does it matter?
I don't believe for the purpose of this case it does, no. And I was using machinery as more of a shorthand for machinery or equipment. But we have parts, right? And they all perform their own functions. In many instances, perhaps in all instances, they are unique functions, and that is a point the department, I think, unwittingly emphasizes, which is that there are not substitutes for most or all of the parts within any particular piece of machinery. They emphasize that the disputed items in this case do not have substitutes, and that's true for any of the other parts that the department concedes are exempt. It's against that backdrop that the court must interpret this statute. We have a statute that provides the exemption for machinery or equipment. By definition, by just common sense, it also includes all of the component parts. We also have a case where we have the benefit of not having any doubt or any debate about legislative intent, because that's been addressed by this court in the Duval case and by our Supreme Court in the Capital Castings 3 case. We know what this statute was intended to accomplish.
Well, counsel, let me
Yes.
try to simplify this a little bit from my standpoint. And in Capital Castings 3, the Supreme Court said silica sand used to make moldings for grinding balls and custom cast items, binders, mold wash, hot topping powders were all exempt,
Correct.
despite the fact, okay, so they were all exempt. I have a hard time seeing why, if that's the case, why the oils and lubricants in this case would not also be exempt. Isn't that, I mean, we're bound by the Supreme Court's ruling. I don't see any way of really distinguishing between the two.
Well, I I agree with you wholeheartedly. I've always had a problem with that, and furthermore, when you get to the sort of irony of the case, which is that Capital Castings 3 involved, among other things, a lubricating spray that was held as a matter of law exempt, I've never understood how that case can be distinguished. I don't believe it's been effectively distinguished. I guess this may be one of those rare oral arguments where I do sit down early. I don't.
I mean, I'd like,
Yeah.
on the, sort of the flip side of that, yes, I understand the capital castings, or castings case and what our Supreme Court said there, but what's not clear to me from that case or from the other cases I've read is why did the legislature leave in the expendable materials exception? I mean, what, especially in the context of mining, because I know that you've alluded to a couple, I think, or somebody did, alluded to a couple of things like flares. I'm picturing things kicking around on the floorboard of this giant truck, some gloves, some flares, a little toolbox, emergency first aid kit. I mean, is that all we can come up with? What else is there?
Yeah,
that would be expendable materials.
Absolutely, and I want to address that in two parts because I think there are two categories here, and one is something that the court in Capital Castings itself commented on, which would be machinery and equipment, particularly in common parlance, I think we'd say equipment that's used in administrative activities. In other words, we want to separate and contrast between operating a business of mining
So a computer that's sitting in the office,
that generates invoices.
paper that's used to help generate the invoices.
Absolutely.
Okay, that. So what's the other category?
The other
Let me interrupt there, because I understand, but subsection C, it lists out expendable materials as subheading 1, and then you've got 2, 3, 4, and they list, janitorial equipment, office equipment. So those computers and those kinds of things, they have their own subcategory.
Correct. And I
so we
think
still have to come back and say, well, we presume that the legislature actually writes these words and intends to mean something by them. So that's what I'm struggling with. What did they mean by expendable materials?
Yeah, and I think, Capital Castings, looks at those sort of, for example, administrative as expendable materials because that's the context of what that case is about. I think the second category, though, is what I would call ancillary items. And those would be items that are not essential to the integrated systems that accomplish the particular goal of mining the ore, the metallurgical operations.
Example.
Safety equipment would be one. Pollution control, which is the subject of a separate exemption, I think for exactly that purpose. There are going to be items that are necessary to comply with legal requirements, whether it's EPA or MSHA, which I understand is the equivalent of OSHA, for mining operations, various safety items, aftermarket items that, for example, in the taxpayer ruling 03-2, items that are plugged into the electrical sources that may be available in some of this machinery. Sorry?
Work gloves for the
Work
person operating
gloves,
the equipment?
I think those would not be
Exempt?
within the exemption.
What about,
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and this is starting to really split hairs, but it seems like in some ways that's what we're doing here, but washer fluid. In a big truck, washer fluid.
Well, I think it depends.
Integral part.
Well, it's interesting that the department would take the position that becomes part of the automobile in the other statute. I think that would depend on the environmental conditions. If it is necessary, and mining is a very, very different animal. extreme environmental conditions. And if it's necessary to operate the equipment to have a particular kind of fluid that's used because otherwise the operations are going to stop, yeah, I think so. I think that is not an expendable. And let me
Air supply for the tires.
I was afraid the endless hypotheticals.
Is that expendable or not?
Air supply for the tires.
I mean, I'm not talking about the equipment to put the air in the tires. That's something else. Just talking about the air supply.
Just the air supply.
That means?
I would I would have to think about that. That would be a close case. But the point I want to make, though, a bigger picture point, is that yeah, it is narrow, and it's narrow for a reason. It's narrow correctly so, because of the goal that this is intended to accomplish. And if you get down to a granular level where you ask about each and every component part in a machine, let's step back and see what the department is really arguing. You take a bulldozer, you create a list of every component part, and you start with a little checklist, and what, the department, or worse yet, a judge of the Superior Court? We're going to have a trial with experts, and we're going to go down and we're going to check and say, that is really integral. No, that one over there doesn't really function like a machine. You have to have, first of all, you have to have a healthy dose of common sense. You have to understand that, as Capital Castings teaches, that parts are exempt if they are part of an integral system. Judge Kessler, I think you agree with me already. You've expressed that, and I want to answer any questions, Judge Gould or Judge Brown, that you might have about that. Any further questions? But I think the point is it is narrow and correctly so. Lubricating spray is exempt, and it's exempt for a reason. A simple metal pipe is exempt. Why? Because it's essential to complete the task that is called out in the statute as an exempt operation. A couple of other big picture points, and then I think I'll sit down and reserve the rest of my time. I think it should not go unnoticed that the department has conceded that every other part in this machinery and equipment is exempt. Every other one. It has not challenged anything. In fact, two of these fluids, these oils and greases, which all share common properties, they've conceded those too. But the point is that a bolt, a screw, a roller element bearing, we're not here about any of those things because the department has conceded all of those. And we bring up the simple example of a roller element bearing not only because it's something that I and a lot of lay people can understand, but because it performs the same functions, although only a subset of the functions, of these same materials we have in dispute here. It cushions loads, it separates components, it reduces friction, it dissipates heat.
It's just not a liquid.
It's just not a liquid. It's not a viscous liquid. And what does Capital Castings tell us? It tells us in a footnote, because I think the court found it not worthy perhaps of textual treatment, that from a legal perspective, it makes no sense to distinguish between different parts which perform the same or similar functions based on what they are composed of. That's paragraph 25, note 4 of the Capital Castings opinion. We posed that below to the Superior Court. We posed it in our opening brief, and there was no answer to that. How is it that something composed of a different material that performs the same functions, and in fact fewer functions, not an extreme pressure additive, not the cleaning and anti-corrosion properties and a variety of other things, how is it that you distinguish on a legal basis, on a meaningful, legally analytically honest, if you will, basis, how do you distinguish those? I think it's telling that in the Superior Court there was no answer to that, and in the answering brief there was no answer to that. I think unless, again, Judges Brown and Gould, if you have other specific questions, this is my opportunity to respond to them. If not, I will reserve the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Counsel.
Thank you.
Your Honors, Jerry Freeze for the Department of Revenue. The issue in this case is whether or not the expendables language in 4250061C has any meaning, and the law is clear in that statute that expendables are taxable. The fact of the matter is, in 1999, when the legislature amended the statute, when capital castings came out and they looked at it, the legislature could have amended the statute to say that all tangible personal property sold to a mining operation shall be deductible or exempt. They didn't do that. They retained the expendables exemption. So clearly that has meaning. It's not the law that everything important in a mining operation, everything sold to a mining operation necessary for it to be conducted is deductible. And again, that's what the legislature did back in 1999. They retained that language. And what they equally did back in 1999, as the amicus point out on page 20 of their brief, is the legislature at one point, one draft of the bill talked about expendable materials. For purposes of this paragraph, expendable materials are items that are ancillary to the operation or use of the equipment. And that language did not make it to the final bill, to the amendment to 5061C1. And so they rejected that. So the idea that expendables applies to ancillary equipment only was rejected by the legislature. They could have, but they didn't.
You'd agree with me, I hope, that we're bound by the Supreme Court's decision
Oh, I agree.
in capital castings thread.
To a degree.
And you know where I'm going to go with this.
Oh, I
So-
do. You've already gone there, Your Honor.
Right, so just give me your best shot. I mean, I'm not for, my mind's open.
Sure.
But I have a hard time distinguishing when the court says hot toppings, which is a powder used to keep the molten metal in the sleeve from cooling, and mold wash is, and some of the lubricants in this case are exempt, but why the lubricants that you're claiming aren't exempt differ from those?
Because in capital castings, the court pointed to items of machinery used in the qualifying operation for which the expendable materials performed an identical function. And in that case, you had a metal mold. And what the court said, you have a metal mold, which we all agree is a piece of equipment. The expendables in that case, the sand, the silica and all that, the epoxies that hold it together to make a form, function like a piece of metal equipment.
But what about the hot topping and the mold? I understand that, but the cement and the lime was taxable.
Well, that was because it was found to be an ancillary operation.
Right, but
But
then
again,
they
in that,
say the hot topping, a powder used to cover the end of the sleeve to keep the molten metal in the sleeve from cooling, is exempt. And the mold wash sprayed on to keep the sand from sticking, exempt. How do you distinguish that from lubricants that are made so the equipment won't fail?
because together it function like a piece of machinery or equipment in that qualifying operation. There's no comparable piece of machinery or equipment in this case that functions like a lubricant. You have, for example, in this case, you have what's called open gear lubricants, which are sprayed onto open gears. There's no comparable piece of equipment that can do that. You can't spray ball bearings at an open gear. You can't put ball bearings into an engine and expect that it will lubricate the engine. They have different functions. So it doesn't function like equipment. There's no comparable piece of equipment.
So you're saying if it's a liquid, that there isn't a comparable solid that could be used to perform the same function, then the liquid is not, it's not exempt.
In the qualifying operation, in capital castings, the court mentioned the word function or functional equivalency 10 to 12 times. It has to be the functional equivalent. The fact of the matter is expendables in any qualifying operation, whether it be mining, manufacturing, whatever it might be, don't operate in a void. They don't levitate above the qualifying operation and operate. They operate in the context and in connection with machinery, whatever that might be. And so, do they work together to perform a function? They do. And the example I would think of would be an automobile, a diesel automobile, which has a muffler. And if you're a BMW vehicle, unlike a VW, but if you're a BMW vehicle, you have the muffler. And then you have what's called AdBlue or urea. There's a tank filled with 2 or 3 gallons of AdBlue, which works in connection with the muffler. Okay, does it form a functioning operating system, integrated operating system? It does, but they perform different functions within that system. A muffler does not function like AdBlue. There's no comparable piece of equipment that can function like urea.
What ball bearings can you use without lubricant?
I think the question is what equipment, including ball bearings, can function like a lubricant?
I've never seen a ball bearing that doesn't have some type of lubricant, ever.
I agree. And that goes to my analogy with the BMW, and that is the lubricant works in connection with the piece of equipment and machinery, but they perform different functions.
You have ball bearings and lubricant. You can't have just ball bearings. If you had any machinery.
I agree.
With just ball, so they do function together.
They do function together, I agree, but they perform different functions.
They perform different functions?
They do
You think
perform
that ball
different
bearings
functions.
perform a different function than lubricant in an engine or a piece of equipment?
They help the equipment to operate, there's no doubt about that. But the particular operation of the expendables, and that's what we have in capital castings.
Well, I don't think I've ever seen a piece of equipment that operates the way you were talking about.
Well, we admit that it cannot operate without lubricants. We admit that. There's no doubt about that. Without the lubricants, without the whatever fluids they may take into account, they cannot operate.
So they're essential.
They are essential. There's no doubt about that. And so,
But they're as essential as having a spark plug.
they are. But a spark plug is a piece of equipment. And it's
But
called
you're
machinery and
saying-
equipment deduction. It's not called everything that they sell.
You're almost saying it's because it's physical in the sense that it's hard. It's not a liquid. It's a non-liquid. Spark plug's non-liquid.
It's commonly understood to be equipment. And that's, the capital castings court didn't have difficulty with that. I mean, the fact of the matter, a spark plug wears out, but if a spark plug is considered to be a piece of equipment or a piece of machinery or part of machinery.
So what could be used, I'm sorry, will you?
No, go ahead.
Let's talk about the mold wash and the hot topping in capital castings.
Sure.
You're saying that, is there a piece of equipment that could be used in lieu of that?
The metal mold.
Excuse me?
The metal mold.
But the metal mold needs that lubricant, otherwise for instance, the mold, the powder, the hot topping is to keep the molten metal in the sleeve from cooling.
Right, but that has to do with the piece of equipment created from expendable materials. That had to do with the sand and the epoxy. It's the metal mold stood by itself, and then you had the molds created from the expendables, and they consisted of a number of things. And the court said because this creation from expendable materials is identical to a piece of equipment that is deductible under the machinery and equipment deduction, it's the functional equivalent.
So the hot topping is the functional equivalent of a piece of equipment?
The metal mold. The court looked at the totality, what the constituent elements it takes to create a mold out of sand and glue and whatever other elements that they had.
But all that's used is to keep the metal from cooling.
I agree.
So,
But it was part of it operated like a metal mold, is what the court found.
so that's the best shot at trying to. I mean, I just want to make sure I understand.
The best shot is the statute, quite frankly.
Well,
the
I understand
the
that.
deduction is given to the machinery. It doesn't say everything important. If that's what they intended.
I understand that, but I'm trying to get to. I understand that. I appreciate
Sure,
that.
sure.
If we were looking at on a blank slate,
I agree.
I think that would be very persuasive.
Sure.
But we've got to look at the non-blank slate, the slate that's been written on,
Right.
the hand that written went on, which is the Supreme Court.
Right.
And so your best shot at saying this is different is because of the hot topping. It's like the metal sleeve.
That's what the Supreme Court said in
Okay.
footnote 4.
Okay.
It functions like a piece of equipment. That's what the court said. I doubt when the legislature drafted the machinery and expendables deduction that they had in mind hot topping. Did anyone know hot topping existed? No one had any idea that existed, I'm quite sure.
That's probably right.
What were they thinking?
But your argument there
What
would
were
be
they thinking?
upstairs.
I only know that it goes on ice cream. I don't know.
Right,
what it is.
hot fudge sundae.
Or cake. Or cake. There's
I
hot
wish I
topping
were
on
a Dairy
cake.
Queen right now, quite
Quite
frankly.
delicious.
Right. So when you talk,
Yeah, but I understand that. But wasn't that a better argument for upstairs? That, listen, when the legislature drafted this, they didn't know what hot toppings were.
no, well, I'm here, and I need to go
I
here.
understand that.
before go
I
up
understand
there,
that.
Right. And so,
I appreciate that.
So, but what do they have in mind when you talk about machinery and equipment to a mining operation, but we don't take expendables into account? What could they have possibly meant, if not oil and washes and sprays and whatever it may be to keep the machinery functioning? And there has to be an alternative, and it's not ancillary equipment. We know that because the legislature rejected that back in 1999. It's not desks, It's something that is necessary at expendable things used up within the qualifying operation that are expended. And if they don't function like a piece of machinery and equipment, again, machinery and equipment is the name of the deduction. It's in the statute. Only machinery and equipment qualify.
But what's the point of the amendment where it talks about the the amendment to the statute then?
Well, the amendment to C1, Your Honor,
Yes.
I think the point of that was what they talked about in capital castings, is some expendables function like machinery or equipment. Those that do qualify for the machinery or equipment deduction. And that's why when the legislature amended it, they said that the life of the particular item will not be a disqualifying factor. So,
See, I mean, you think that the legislature couldn't envision that a piece of equipment requires lubricant and grease and oil to,
oh, I think they did.
so I don't understand your point about what could the legislature be thinking. I mean, they made this amendment to sort of clarify it, and it makes common sense. A piece of machinery, a piece of equipment includes a lubricant, but you don't want to exclude it because it's expendable, so it's still exempt under the statute. What's wrong with that?
The legislature kept the expendables language. If they wanted to get rid of it and wanted to take out oil and lubricants and all that, they could have done that. And they could have written it to say all tangible personal property sold to a mining operation will be deductible.
Well,
They didn't do
with
that.
regardless of the cost or useful life of the property?
No, they didn't do that. What they did,
Specific enough.
again, what they did in capital castings, the case makes clear, is if it functions, again, the word function appears 10 or 12 times. If it functions like machinery or equipment, it qualifies. And the deductible materials at issue in capital castings function like a metal mold. And so, again, C1 has to have meaning. We have to give it meaning. And if it means nothing, say it means nothing, and I can end my, it will end for the department, and we'll move on. But it's not the case that everything really important qualifies. They could have said that. They didn't say that. The fact of the matter is, every piece of expendable material will have some kind of comparable function, I think, in a machine. I'm thinking to myself, what could qualify? What do they mean? So we have a mining operation. We have extremely large trucks, and it's probably really smelly. And so we put a little air freshener in the cab of the truck that will make it pleasant for the operator to be there. But there are other pieces of machinery and equipment that have that function too. You can have a fan that will blow the air out.
What
You can have rubber seals around the doors that perform that, quote, general function.
What about why were the hydraulic oils and transmission fluids not taxed? The department determined those were not taxable. Those were exempt, but not the engine oil, gear oil, grease, and open gear lube.
Well, they did what the Supreme Court did in capital castings, is they did an element-by-element analysis, and that's what, again, the court did in capital castings. And what they concluded there was, I had to look myself up on Wikipedia, which was a terrible thing to do, but I did it anyway.
Oh, well, it usually is.
What do hydraulic fluids do? I had no idea. And what the department concluded was that hydraulic fluids operate like a piece of machinery. They operate to exert force. They operate like a lever or a machine, whatever it might be. And it's the same kind of distinction that the Supreme Court made in capital castings, where you look at something, and you look at the other, and you say, well,
Transmission fluids?
pardon me?
Transmission
It was
fluids?
the same kind of issue. It was a pressurized operation, and it conveyed energy between the gears, and is what they concluded. The fact of the matter is, I would have been equally comfortable defending that, quite frankly. If they hadn't given it to it, I would have defended that. So, again,
Fair enough.
yes.
Fair enough.
So it is what it is. It's like the previous case. They got it for 10 and 11, and now they want it for 9. Well, you got a gift for 10 and 11, and in a way, maybe they got a gift here. But I would have defended it. So I think we're all aware of the issues and the arguments, and if the court has no other questions.
Nope.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
I'd like to respond to 2 points. One is that the distinction that counsel has tried to draw with capital castings is the wrong paradigm. What the Supreme Court said was that the materials, the items in dispute together functioned like a metal mold. The question was, is that operation, is that sand casting operation itself, does that qualify as machinery and equipment? Because is it a group of parts that work together to achieve something that we would look at as a machine-like operation? And the court said, yes, it's similar to a metal casting, which the department conceded. There's no suggestion in the opinion that a lubricating spray has some solid substitute, nor did
What's that?
I mean,
how can you put we can't put roller bearings in there, I would
no,
assume.
of course not. Of course not. And the difference is that our case is so much simpler. There's no dispute about whether the operation, the process, the machine functions as a machine or functions as machinery or equipment. That was really an issue in capital castings. That issue doesn't exist here because everyone agrees that the parts functioning together operate as a machine.
Without these oils, and I guess where you're going is without the disputed items,
Yes.
the gear oil, grease, and open gear lube, and the engine oil, the equipment would just fail. It would it would just not blow up, but it would just fail. It might implode on itself. It would freeze, whatever it is.
More than that, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be shipped to the site because it would collapse on itself. As we pointed out, and the record is clear, it has to be shipped with these in place. The amount of pressure in these enormous machines is unbelievable. These are not, and let me, I heard in argument that keep machinery running. No. It doesn't just keep machinery running. That's wrong. The other thing I would say is that what we still haven't heard even this morning is what on earth, how would this work if we have a substitute piece of solid, a substitute solid object or a substitute other object? What's the substitute for the roller element bearing? There's no substitute. The department can't say, or for a gear or any other part in this. If the test is, there's some substitute machine, I mean, they can't even come up with an example of such a thing. And at the end of the day, when you look at the items that were conceded to be exempt, what is the definition we have of what they want to say is expendable or is like a machine? You take each component part, ask, is it like a machine? What on earth is the definition of that? Who's going to decide? We still don't have a definition. We're in the Court of Appeals now, and in the briefs below and in the briefs on appeal, we have yet to hear the department's definition of what it means or how that test could ever be applied. And with that, unless the court has any questions, this is going to be the rare argument where I don't even use all of my rebuttal time.
Okay. Any questions? No?
Thank
you,
you.
counsel. Thank both counsel for their arguments. We will take this matter under advisement and issue a written decision in due course. With that, we stand adjourned.